Hi everyone, I'm Susan Mulvihill and welcome back to my garden. A little while back I posted a question on my Facebook page asking you what questions you have about all kinds of gardening topics. Holy cow, did I get a response. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed, but I'm going to do my best to answer all of your questions. Now, I've been trying to keep my videos to a reasonable length so I don't bore you to tears. And so what my plan is to make 2 videos answering half your questions this week and the other half next week. So let's get started. So my first question has to do with deer. Ugh, what a problem. So Eugene writes, I am in North Carolina and I have a big deer issue. They even eat the deer-resistant plants. Well, Eugene, I can really commiserate with you because deer are so challenging, and some years they'll eat something that they didn't eat the year before. They also haven't read the book about the plants that they're not supposed to like. Also, if they are very stressed, especially by dry weather where they need that moisture from plants in our landscapes, they're going to be very bold and come in. I did write a recent column and I filmed a video on dealing with deer in the garden. It ran on May 27th of this year, 2018. And the way you can find both is by going to my website, susansinthegarden.com. Go to the guides menu and you'll see a column index. If you go to the 2018 column index, just look for May 27th and you can look directly at the column I wrote and also at the video. But the main thing about dealing with deer is that you have 3 main types of strategies. One is you can try to scare them away. Another method is to repel them. And the third way is to exclude them from the garden using different types of barriers. So I hope this will help you, and I wish you good luck with the deer because they are really a big problem. Now, before I get started on the insect questions, I wanted to explain that I do have an organic pest control guide on my website, susansinthegarden.com. If you go under the guides menu, you will see Organic Pest Control Guide. I wanted to create a nice resource for folks dealing with insect problems. And so there's 2 main ways that you can find a solution. One is to go to the insect name, like let's say you have cabbage worms, you know they're cabbage worms, you just go to that page and it lists everything that you can do to control them and how to do it. The other thing you can do if you don't know what the insect is you can go to the crop that you're growing. So let's say broccoli. You know you have holes in the leaves, and so you go to that symptom, and that will link to cabbage worms, and then it tells you what to do. So be sure to check that out. It's certainly not an all-inclusive list. And again, I'm going to keep adding to it as I have the opportunity, but I'm trying to make it a really useful guide for everyone. Deborah wants to know the best ways to prevent slugs and keep them from returning. Well, there are a few options. First of all, you need to know that slugs tend to be nocturnal. And so they're going to hide in places during the daytime. And so if you have any kind of debris in your garden, like boards or something they can hide under during the day, I would try to clean up that debris if it's an option. There's also organic slug baits on the market. You just sprinkle it on a garden bed around the things that they seem to be going back to, and that should help. Another possibility is beer traps, and those are where you use either a cat food can or a tuna can that's empty. You put it into the soil so that the lip of the can is right at the surface of the soil. You put in about 1 inch of beer. The slugs are attracted to the smell of the yeast in the beer. They come to investigate, fall in, and drown. Yay! Another possibility is using something called copper tape. You can easily find it at most garden centers. It comes in a small roll, and what you do is, let's say you're planting some plants like broccoli that they tend to come and chew on. You put a ring of it around the base of each plant, and what that does is it causes an electrical reaction with the skin of the slugs, and it's something they do not like at all, so they avoid that area. I've used that for a couple of years now, and it works really well. So I hope these ideas will give you some help. Sally B says, I live in Rock County, Wisconsin. I'm wondering about how to address ants both in the flower and veggie garden. I emailed Sally back just to clarify what type of ant she was talking about, since there's quite a few different types. And she said that she's dealing with the tiny black ants that have a nasty bite. I have felt that bite, and I agree, it is nasty. So sometimes those little black ants are quite innocuous, and you can just ignore them. But if they do cause problems with plants, try an organic ant bait, or diatomaceous earth, or a spray that contains spinosad. So let me explain those last two things. First of all, diatomaceous earth is a flour-like substance. You can purchase it in garden centers, and it's made from the fossilized remains of diatoms or algae. And so it's very safe for you to handle, although you certainly wouldn't want to breathe it in. And what you do is you sprinkle it on the ground around the plants you're trying to protect. Because it has little sharp edges that we can't feel but insects can feel, it cuts into their skin, dehydrates them, and they die. So that works as a really nice barrier around plants. The spinosad is the active ingredient in some types of organic sprays. One brand that I know of is Captain Jack's Dead Bug Brew. I love that name. And what you do is you mix it with a bit of sugar to attract the ants. And we have some friends who were recently having a horrible problem with black ants that were being very damaging, and this worked great for them. There's something you need to know about spinosad, however. Do not put it anywhere near flowers because it can kill bees. But if you're putting it at the base of a plant, you should be just fine. I hope that helps. Paula wants to know about how to control squash bugs. She says, I don't want to spray anything. We have bees that love the blooms, and I don't want to kill any bees. Well, kudos to you, Paula, for not wanting to use any sprays. That is great. I have to admit, we don't get squash bugs here. It's not a regional thing. I just don't have them in my garden, and I'm hoping it stays that way. But I do know of a way to thwart them. So squash bugs overwinter in the soil, they emerge in the spring, they fly to different types of cucurbits. Those would be things like squash, melons, cucumbers, and pumpkins. They mate and lay eggs. Generally, what I've found is they have one generation per year. And so what you want to do next year, because this year's a done deal, is to either plant your squash or other types of cucurbits in a different area from before so that they won't emerge from the soil and find those plants. And then as soon as you plant any seeds or seedlings, cover them immediately with floating row cover. I've mentioned floating row cover before. It's a lightweight fabric that lets in air and light, but you can use it as a physical barrier against certain types of insects. So leave the cover on until the plants start flowering. Then you just remove it for the rest of the season. This breaks the cycle of the squash bug's life. But anytime you see them, make sure that you knock them off the plants. And what I love to do is just to make a small pail of soapy water. I knock the insect into there and they drown in it, and it works really great. So I hope this will help. So Jane writes that she's looking for organic how-tos for pests. And of course, I've already mentioned the Organic Pest Control Guide on my website. But she says right now it's carpenter bees and yellow jacket nests. Now, first of all, Jane, make sure you have the correct ID on the carpenter bees because they and bumblebees can look very similar. Now, the carpenter bees have bare black abdomens, whereas the bumblebees have fuzzy black abdomens. So just make sure you have the right one. Carpenter bees tunnel into wood. They target bare wood, so if it's an option, paint any exposed wood. Also, in the springtime, consider keeping your garage and your outbuildings closed so that they won't go inside when they're looking for places to lay their eggs. Now, even though none of us like the yellow jackets, I have to mention they are an important pollinator. But if they're close to your house where they can become a hazard or a problem, like let's say you're trying to eat your dinner outside or something, you certainly could put up those yellow jacket traps from Rescue. They work very effectively, and what I like about their traps is that they use an attractant, not a chemical. So it's something that is very safe to use. So that would be an option for you. Susie asked, how do you control earwigs? Well, earwigs can be a bit of a problem. They are generally nocturnal, and so what you can do is to place some rolled up cardboard or newspaper near the troublesome area, and what they do is they hide inside it during the daytime hours, then just in the morning you collect the newspaper or the cardboard and dispose of it. Another thing you can use is diatomaceous earth. I explained earlier how it works. Just don't put it near flowers because it can kill bees. Remember, don't breathe it in. And of course it works for other types of insects that are a problem, such as slugs, pill bugs, and cutworms. So keep that in mind as an option. Peg wants to know how to control those darned Japanese beetles. Well, first of all, you have my sympathies, Peg, because they are awful. But I also have to say, we don't have Japanese beetles here in eastern Washington state yet. I suppose at some point they're going to adapt to our weather, but I hope it's a very long time from now. I did see a recent article on Japanese beetles in Fine Gardening magazine. And one of the things they stress is to make sure you do have the correct ID, that it really is a Japanese beetle. And that applies to all kinds of insect problems. Make sure you know exactly what you're dealing with before you do something about it, because sometimes the insect is beneficial. However, we all know that Japanese beetles are not beneficial in any way. What they recommended is frequent hand picking of them off of the plants that they're on. And of course, I love using the soapy dishwater in a little pail, and that's a great way to just knock them in there and they can't get out of it. They also said do not use Japanese beetle traps because apparently they attract more to your garden than you had before, and you certainly don't want that. The first vegetable question comes from Julie. She says, why do my potato plants never flower, and does it matter? I've tried growing them in the ground, in raised beds, and in bags. 3 seasons with few potatoes and no flowers. Well, Julie, I have to be honest with you. I was not familiar with the flowering problem, and so I had to do a little research, but here's what I learned. First of all, not all varieties of potatoes bloom. That's interesting. Also, whether they bloom or not has no bearing on potato production, so don't worry about that. And also it can happen in northern climates. But it does bother me that you're not getting very many potatoes, and so here's what I would recommend. I would suggest adding in some phosphorus to your garden soil. So that would be the middle number on a fertilizer package, and what I recommend is using bone meal because that's an organic version of phosphorus. And so I would add in some to the garden beds next year and see how your potatoes do. Marcia writes, why are my green beans flat this year? It happened one time before too. Well, I'm not sure what kind of beans you're growing and if this applies to all of your beans or just a few, but I would assume just a few. This can be caused by heat stress, for one thing. If you live in an area that is getting a very hot, dry summer, that can certainly adversely impact your beans. Also, not enough water, which goes along with the heat stress. So make sure that you're watering them regularly, and that when your temperatures warm up in the summer, you increase the amount of time they're getting watered. If this has happened with the same variety before, consider trying a new variety for next year's garden. Eleanor asks, if you have a very small space in which to garden and you love tomatoes, are there steps you can take to reduce the likelihood of disease as you repeatedly grow tomatoes and other plants in the same family in the same place? Wow, Eleanor, that is an excellent question, and I do have some options for you. First of all of the plant families, the tomato family, which is also known as the nightshade family or Solanaceae, has the most potential for disease problems, and that's why it's important to rotate them. Other members of the tomato family include potatoes, peppers, eggplants, and tomatillos. So this will apply to all of those crops. Now, the first thing you might consider doing is try growing those crops in containers in alternate years. So let's say one year you grow your plants in your garden space, the next year in containers, then back to the garden space. Or even better still, one year in the garden space, one year in the container, and the next year in the container. So the plan is that you would have fresh potting soil every single time you use your pots. You do not want to reuse that potting soil because there might be some disease pathogens in there, and you don't want that. Another thought is to put down mulch on the ground below your plants, and that way when they're getting watered or if it's raining, soil is not splashing up onto the leaves, which will begin the disease process. Also, you definitely want to prune off the lowest branches of your plants so that they're not resting on the soil surface, again with the potential for contacting some pathogens. Now, another thought I had was regarding tomato varieties. Whether you are purchasing tomato seedlings or you're starting your own plants from seed, make sure that you plant varieties that have a lot of disease resistance, because that should help you. And if you have certain diseases that you have experienced in your garden in the past, or your region has certain ones that are very prevalent, I would look for that type of disease resistance. I hope these ideas help. Joanne wants to know, how can you grow a small veggie or herb garden if your entire backyard is shady? Oh boy, that is challenging. Now, I did write a column about this very topic on April 10th, 2016. I realize that seems like a long time ago, but you can still find it by going to my website, susansinthegarden.com. Go to the guides menu and to the column index for 2016, and you'll see it there. But leafy vegetables such as spinach, lettuce, and Swiss chard tend to be tolerant to some shade, as do radishes, beets, carrots, and peas. So you could experiment with some of those. But I'm wondering, can you possibly grow some veggies or herbs in pots and put them in a sunny location? Like, let's say maybe your front porch or your front walkway gets some sunlight. That would be a possibility. Another thought is to use some hanging baskets. But another thought I had was to try vertical gardening, and I wrote about that earlier this year, 2018, so you can also find that on my website. So what I'm thinking about is, if you have an arbor or a trellis of some sort in your garden, a lot of times the upper portion of that arbor or trellis gets some sunlight, and you can get away with growing some vining types of crops such as peas, pole beans, cucumbers, small melons, or small winter squash. So those are all possibilities to give a try. Jay wants to know, what is our annual best crop, because it always seems to be a surprise. And if I understand your question right, Jay, what you're asking is, what is doing the best this year? And I would have to say it's definitely peppers. They are loving being in the hoop house, and they seem to really like that solar mulch, which is a green plastic mulch I've been using, and it works really well. A close runner-up would have to be our melons, and coincidentally, or not coincidentally, they are also growing in the green solar mulch, and they are producing like gangbusters. So Judy wants to know, what do you plant in your big flower border in front of your home? It is beautiful. How do you keep it blooming all summer long? Well, Judy, thank you very much for the compliment. I have to admit, this is one of my favorite flower beds. I love all of the different colors. I love having as many flowers as possible. And even though I haven't been real scientific about it, I've tried to make sure that I have flowers blooming all season long. And you notice that, so thank you. What I have is spring blooming perennials and bulbs, so things like columbines, peonies, tulips, daffodils, and alliums. And then I have plants that bloom all summer long into the fall, which is great. So examples of those would be black-eyed Susans, gloriosa daisies right there, bee balm, phlox, oriental lilies, and daylilies. There's more things that I haven't mentioned. I have a few ornamental grasses, but you're referring really to the flowers. I make sure the bed gets watered on a regular basis because that is so important, especially with the hot weather we've been getting. We definitely have increased the amount of water that the bed gets. I try to deadhead them regularly, but sometimes it's hard to keep up with that. And then the last thing that I do is I try to put a thin layer of compost onto the surface of the soil either every spring or every other spring. It just depends on how much compost I have handy. So thank you again for the compliment, and I hope this gives you a few ideas of some things to plant in your own flower bed. Ginger wants to know about cutting the spent canna lilies to promote more blooms. And so this is a canna lily here. I've overwintered it from last year, and it did just have this big flower spike on it. And I let all of the flowers bloom, and then I cut it down quite low on the stalk because I know that that same stalk is not going to produce any more flowers. And then I should point out, here is a new flower stalk coming up here. So same thing, I'll let everything bloom because there's several flowers on it, and then I'll trim it off down low. So Marcia says, I'd like to relocate my daffodils. What time of year should I do that? Thanks for all of your garden tips. Well, first of all, you are very welcome. I'm always happy to help. So daffodils can be moved anytime, but the best time is after they've finished blooming in the spring. Sally P. asks, how and when should I split perennials? Some of mine are so big and crowded. Well, Sally, when they are overcrowded, that's a perfect indicator that they should be divided. And you can see some of my daylilies definitely need to be divided this fall. Fall is the best time to do it, and it's really quite simple. All you do is you take a shovel, you go down the middle of the plant and divide it into some nice sized clumps. Pull out any weeds, it's your big chance to do that. But the thing that is nice about it is you can share those plants with friends and neighbors. You can move them around into other areas of your garden. So it's a good thing to split and divide perennials, and it's very simple. A few of you have directed your questions more towards me, and it's been kind of fun looking at them. So Michael wants to know, what is your biggest gardening fail? Or fails, as the case may be. And boy, where do I start? You know, gardening is a learning process. I've made a lot of mistakes, and that's how I've learned from them and gotten a little bit smarter, but there's still a lot I don't know. And I still make mistakes. But certainly planting a lot of things that deer like to eat, especially early on. We had no clue because we'd never dealt with deer before. So we planted things like hostas and roses and arborvitae hedges, and the deer just chowed down on them, which was really frustrating. Another big thing that we have a problem with as our landscape matures is planting things where they're apparently not getting enough light, especially vegetable crops. And it's something we need to address, but we hate to chop down trees and such. So that has been a huge problem for us. I'd say those are the two big ones. Sorelda wants to know the one gardening habit I have that is the best, that I couldn't garden without, maybe with unintended positive consequences. Well, I would have to say keeping a garden journal, because it is impossible for me to remember everything. A lot of times I think I'm going to remember the name of a plant I want to buy or a plant I never want to grow again and so on, and the only way I really am going to remember is by keeping some good notes. Also, when plants should be put in, when seeds should be started, and so on. And of course, I cannot recommend this enough, because keeping a garden journal is the way we learn from our mistakes and our successes. Martina wants to know, when you travel or not, do you have help taking care of your garden besides you and your husband? Well, Martina, no, we really don't. We've tried to make our garden as self-sufficient as possible. For one thing, we have all of the watering system on a timer, which is a tremendous time saver. And when we are out of town, at least we know the garden is still getting watered. So that's a good thing. However, when we leave and the weather is a little iffy, boy, I'm sweating bullets and crossing my fingers that we don't get an early frost or a late frost, depending upon the time of year. And so there are times where things go wrong, but for the most part, it's pretty self-sufficient. The last two questions are pretty funny, and I have to admit they made me laugh. Sarah asks, what time do you get up and what time do you make it to bed? I think she thinks I'm out here with a headlamp in the dark and working away, but I'm not, I assure you. And Joe says, yes, Susan, where do you get all of your energy? Well, I have to admit, I've always been a pretty high energy person, and I'm quite the list maker, much to my husband's dismay. This time of year, I'm usually up at about 5 a.m. because I want to work out in the garden before it gets too hot. I just do not do well in this high heat. It's awful. I don't stay up very late though. There's just not enough hours in a day, but I just do the best I can and try to grow a nice garden. Okay, that concludes the first half of all of the questions that were asked of me. And if I didn't answer your question this time, I apologize. Hopefully I can get to it next time. But you all asked great questions. I hope this was helpful. I hope you don't think this video is way too long, and certainly give me some feedback if you think so. But there were a lot of questions to answer. I'll see you next week.